So on the screen, right there, you'll see the cover of a best-selling book, a book you can still buy on Amazon. It's called Rock and a Hard Place, One Boy's Triumphant Story. And it's written by a 14-year-old named Anthony Godby Johnson, and you can see him right there. It's the inspirational memoir of a boy who grew up being horrifically abused by his birth parents. Eventually, he found a loving home with Vicki Johnson, a social worker, only to be diagnosed with AIDS from that earlier abuse. Anthony, Tony, became friends with celebrities like Mr. Rogers, and his story was featured on Oprah and a whole host of other shows. This courageous boy's story offered hope to countless people. Now, one person particularly touched by Tony's story was author Armistead Maupin. He made contact with Tony and began a friendship by phone, sometimes talking to Vicki, Tony's adopted mother, and sometimes to Tony, who was bedridden with AIDS complications. Maupin found himself continually inspired by this terminally ill boy's resilience, joy, and appreciation of life. And then one day the phone rang, and Maupin's spouse, Terry, picked it up. It was Vicki, remember the social worker, Tony's adopted mother? He talked to her for about 10 minutes and hung up, Maupin says, and turned to me and said, "I can't believe you've never noticed it." I said, "Noticed what?" He said, "It sounds like the same voice as Tony to me." Now Maupin was floored, and suddenly he began putting things together. Tony had always been too ill for him to visit, so he'd never actually seen the boy. And it turned out no one else had actually seen Tony either. Mr. Rogers had only talked to him on the phone. Same for the people who published the book, same for the people at HBO who were going to make Tony's story into a movie. The truth was that Tony never existed. The boy in the photo was somebody else. Vicki, who had supposedly been Tony's guardian, had pretended to be Tony all along, writing that book and having phone conversations as Tony with countless people, famous and non-famous. Why? Who knows? I don't know. Maybe as a social worker, Vicki had likely witnessed a lot of what she put into Tony's story. Maybe she wanted to draw focus to abused children. Maybe she wanted to inspire people, which she unquestionably did. And maybe she wanted attention. Despite the deception, Maupin looks back fondly on his conversations with Tony. It even inspired him to write a novel called The Night Listener, which was then made into a movie. And he isn't alone in his experience. All kinds of relationships amongst people were built who were inspired by Vicki's story. People who built organizations to help abused children and those dealing with AIDS. So what does this story have to do with a sermon about God? Simple. Sometimes we can get the details wrong and something can still have truth. Now, I'm not saying factual truth isn't important. It is. What I'm saying is that sometimes in our attempts to understand something, we get the details wrong. But that doesn't mean there isn't some underlying truth there. Just as at the heart of the Tony deception, there was a story full of emotional, if not factual, truth. Throughout history, there's been a universal human impulse to make meaning of our lives, to make sense of our place in the universe. And in describing what I believe to be indescribable, we have used the word God. So whether the details of God have been correct or not, the point is that underlying impulse to make meaning of our existence, that is true. Now, something true for me early on was that I knew what God looked like. When I entered Delaware Elementary School in Washington Township as a kindergartner, that big classroom full of energetic kids was pretty intimidating. But I had one comfort during that time. You see, on the wall of every classroom of that school, we had a framed picture of God, a stern but kind-looking man with a fluff of hair, white hair, on either side of his head. I'd look at that picture and it would inspire me to reach out to other kids who were also feeling lonely, because I knew that God wanted me to be as kind to others as possible. And whenever someone teased me or I was feeling lonely, I could look at that portrait and know I wasn't alone. Now, I've been lucky enough to track down that portrait thanks to the internet, where you can find anything. So you guys are in for a real treat today. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, God. There he is. Now, you know, it makes sense to me now that a school in Washington Township would have a picture of George Washington in every classroom, but at 5 years old, God just seemed a more likely choice. So that same year, that kindergarten year, a few weeks before Christmas, my mother came to me and she asked me, she said, "Do you want to start going to church?" Now, I knew some of the neighborhood kids went to church, so I enthusiastically said, "Yeah." Then as she walked away, I remember finding myself thinking, wondering how long I'd committed myself to this church thing. And, you know, now with attending seminary, I guess the answer is I committed myself for life. Anyway, once we were settled on the pew in that old Christian church building, I looked around for that picture of God like we had in my kindergarten class. I was confused. This was church. Where was God? But my confusion promised to come to an end, as I soon found myself playing a lamb in the church's annual nativity pageant. At the rehearsal, the narrator said, "Before this pageant ends, we'll meet the Lord our God." At last, I thought. Finally, the night of the performance came, and my excitement built at the thought of seeing God. Ryan Smith and I put on our lamb costumes, which covered every inch of us, except for a small area cut out for our faces. And with all that white wool and padding, the costumes were hot. Really hot. Well, Ryan, who was a year younger than me, didn't like it from the start. "Do I have to wear it?" he whined. "I'm hot!" But he was quickly shushed, and the play began. So there we were, standing up on the third level of risers, alongside wise men and shepherds, and in this elaborate nativity scene, with most of the congregation packed into the sanctuary, and with the big church boiler cranked up to keep out the Indiana cold. It started to get hot. Now, it was okay for the other actors, but they weren't covered from head to toe in 12 pounds of wool. At the point in the show where we were all supposed to be absolutely quiet and still, mesmerized by the light from the star overhead, Ryan began to use his mitted hoof hands to try and remove the cumbersome costume. I grabbed his arm to try and make him stand still, and he shouted, "But I'm hot!" The audience laughed at the antics of the unruly lamb, which caused Mary to forget her lines. From up on the riser, I looked down at Mary as her blank stare fixated on something above us. I looked to see what had immobilized her and found myself gazing into the 5 100-watt bulbs that served as the Star of Bethlehem, only to find myself completely blinded when I looked away. In panic, and still holding Ryan's arm, I stepped forward and we tumbled off the risers and onto the floor unharmed, thanks to the built-in shock absorption of our costumes. There were gasps and then stunned silence in the sanctuary. Then from where we lay on the floor, Ryan's voice wailed, "I'm still hot!" It was only when I got home that I realized I still hadn't seen God. Now, as I got a little older, and I had made the clear distinction between God and George Washington, I began to realize that nobody really had any idea of what God looked like. And why couldn't he be a she? And for that matter, why did God even have to have a body? And if God didn't have a body, then did God even have a personality? Or was God an idea like love? Now that I'm grown up, I find it still confusing, but instead of calling it confusion, I call it mystery, and that feels a lot better. For lots of people, the word God can be confusing and even off-putting, especially with all the baggage that comes with it. And is there anything true at the heart of it? Anything that atheists, agnostics, and believers can agree upon? I think there is. Take Tony, the boy who never existed. At the heart of that factually inaccurate story was a tale of courage, of good triumphing over evil, and the feelings it inspired people to feel were real. The relationships it inspired them to make were real. The good things it inspired them to do were real. This is a lot like the God concept. As theologian Gordon Kaufman said, understanding God is essentially a constructive work of the human imagination, developing a symbolical picture of the world. Human creativity naturally translates ideas into stories or metaphor. So God as metaphor can still have profound meaning because in their emotional, spiritual, and intellectual power, metaphors evoke authentic responses within us. And so for us being able to build a bridge from rationality to faith, we have to open up our understanding of what is true, to recognize metaphor can be a foundation for truth. So at the heart of the God concept or metaphor is the idea of a thing encompassing what humans value most. And I think there are three qualities to this thing: the power of loving human action in overcoming selfishness, the wonder and vastness of creation, and the complexity of life's joys and sorrows. In the dynamic relationship between these things, there is God, a word that represents humankind's attempt to distill the indescribable essence of life into a single named concept. So big ideas, small word. Now, certainly many of us don't believe in the concrete notions of God we find in some churches, notions that often privilege dogmatism over complexity, but the underlying yearning to make meaning of the world through having a concept that helps us look beyond ourselves, that has universal truth. God, then, beyond all the conflicting names, descriptions, and stories, can be understood as true, and we don't have to give up reason to say that. In fact, the Sunday Assembly, the atheist church that's been making the news so much lately, they have a slogan: live better, help often, wonder more. That sounds a lot like what I'm talking about in this progressive understanding of God, only they use 6 words instead of 1. The idea of a core God truth is at the center of our early Unitarian tradition, in the work of Ralph Waldo Emerson, for instance, who believed that there must be a commonality at the heart of all the various religious thoughts, something that transcended cultural differences and faith-science conflicts. This transcendentalist thought, as it came to be known, had tremendous influence on Unitarianism, particularly in its emphasis on the importance of the individual, which is echoed, of course, in our first principle. And out of Emerson's exploration of the individual came the idea that to know God required looking within ourselves. Humanity has a creative spark. It's a thing that allows us to dream, create stories, make music, grow plants, build things, solve problems, raise children. You need creativity to raise children, right? This creativity has elements of mystery, As no one knows why one person can compose a symphony at 5 years old and another can't sing on key to save his life, guilty, and yet we each have our own particular creative gifts. Gordon Kaufman even maintained that creativity is God. For the transcendentalist then, and for us, that means that we have the responsibility to show respect for the unique gifts of our fellow human beings, those little sparks of divinity, if you will, by working to fight the injustice that stops people from living out their full potential. Unitarian Universalism can then be described as a faith that is about acting God out, rather than determining what God is. Acting God out, rather than determining what God is. And maybe we should think of God not even as a noun, but as a verb, or as Sharon Welch suggests, an adverb or adjective, a way of describing the relational quality that emerges when we work together for justice. Now, for some contemporary theologians like Anthony Pinn, the use of God language is no longer relevant. Dr. Pinn argues that the Christian God as understood in African American churches was complicit in their suffering and therefore did not encourage a long, consistent fight against injustice. For him, and maybe for you, then, the word God has too much oppressive baggage for it to be useful. Instead, he suggests that acting in authentic, loving ways within community, that's the way that we achieve wholeness. I respect Dr. Pinn's rejection of God talk, as he calls it, as there's a lot of destructive theology out there. My father's family believes God forbids them from getting medical care. So I've watched relatives, adults and children, die from easily treatable conditions. I know people who live lives of desperation in the closet, fearful of their God's wrath. We all know of horrific atrocities committed in the name of God. And still, at the heart of that misguided theology is the human impulse to make meaning of life, even while there are a lot of imposter gods out there, a lot of Vickies speaking for Tonys in the form of those who supposedly speak for God. And we also all know that God probably isn't what some people imagine any more than God was really George Washington. But I think sometimes we can be a little too harsh in dismissing what others believe simply because we don't buy into the details that resonate for them. For instance, when God and George Washington were the same for me, I clearly needed something in that hostile classroom that could offer me comfort and that could push me toward being my better self. I couldn't have articulated that then, but that was the truth at the center of my understanding or my misunderstanding of God. So even as someone like Anthony Pinn, who with every good reason rejects God talk, his idea of salvation through loving community seems very close to the ideas of God I've been exploring today, reinforcing for me that at the core of the God concept, there is universal truth. And so, if we throw out God altogether because there is bad theology out there, then we risk losing ideas that challenge us, that push us to think beyond what makes immediate sense, that call us into spaces of grace and healing, that ask of us to be more than we think we can be. You know, I think back to that nativity play and how I was so disappointed that God didn't show up. And now I see it differently. God was there all along. God was there in those ridiculous lamb costumes Ryan and I wore, lovingly made by the church's sewing circle. God was there in all those children so earnestly trying to tell an important story on that hot, cramped stage. God was there in the laughter of the audience. And yes, God was there in that story of Jesus. For whether the facts were precisely true or not, the story itself held hope for its audience. But God was there beyond that night. God was there in the sanctuary the next spring when we sat together during a sunrise service after a devastating tornado, the dawn light streaming through the stained glass windows. God was there when our minister was taken by cancer, and we huddled in that sanctuary, holding each other and asking why. God was there a few years later when Ryan's mother, tears streaming down her face for the baby she had lost that week, sang Amazing Grace with the rest of the choir. God was there as we fought for the rights of the local migrant farm workers, as we worked with the intellectually disabled, and as we built a new church building under the watch of that church's first female board president, my mother. God was there, lived out in all of that. In our quest to make meaning of our lives, in our fighting of injustice, in our holding of each other through our sorrows and pain, we can give all of that stuff a bunch of different names. We can call it God, or the divine, or mystery, or human potential, or nature, or love, or we can just leave it unnamed. The vital thing is that whatever we call it, and I don't care what you choose to call it, we recognize that this stuff, which requires us to look inward into the depths of our hearts and minds and look outward as far into the vastness of space as we can comprehend, this stuff is what we do here in church. This is what we nurture, and this is what we come together in celebration of. So in the end, when someone asks me, Jason, do you believe in God? I have to pause. And then I could say, yes. No. Sort of. It depends. But maybe I shouldn't say any of that. Maybe I should ask them a question instead. Maybe I should ask, what matters most to you in your everyday life? And when they answer that it's their children or grandchildren, or their ability to make music or build something with their hands, or it's their friends or family, or it's helping other people, or it's standing barefoot in the cool evening grass looking up at the glittering night sky, I can then say in response, yeah, I find God there too. May we never forget to gaze with awe and wonder on the beauty and possibility of the world we live in. May we treasure it, nurture it, and hold each other through the movement of time and space.